Jim, please unmute. If you have any questions, we're a smaller group today, so you can unmute or raise your hand or chat to me. And it's great to see everyone. And Jim, take it away.
Okay, well, I thank you for the dedication for those who gave up on the weather and are here watching this instead. The topic really is the Holocaust, but I would feel remiss if I didn't start the discussion today a little further afield, because today is the 27th anniversary of the beginning of the Rwandan genocide. The president's plane was shot down on the night of April 6th, and the killing started on April 7th. And so I just at least want to recognize the day has resonance for a couple of reasons, but that's an important one, and I don't want to let it go unmentioned, at least as part of this. The day is kind of significant, I guess, as well, because this evening marks the start of Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, which might be confusing to some people who are thinking, wait a minute, didn't we do that in January? And the answer is yes, because the international community tends to recognize January 27th, which is the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, as the Remembrance Day. And that has become increasingly, I guess, well-known, popular seems like the wrong word to use, in the last few years, in part with some good marketing from groups like the World Jewish Congress and a few others. But the United States never really bought into that the same way. The United States long ago really chose to recognize a different date. And instead we tie our recognition to the anniversary on a lunar calendar, so it moves around, but the anniversary of the beginning of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is a topic I'll take up actually next week when we talk about resistance. But and there's a couple reasons why that happens. Certainly one piece of it is that at least the Jewish community within America didn't really like celebrating and acknowledging a place where over 1 million Jews were murdered, and so few survived. It also, in a way, celebrates a place that was liberated by the Soviets. And in a Cold War era, that isn't a real popular choice either, particularly as they used it to stage propaganda films and things like that. And I rather intentionally use the word liberated as opposed to freed, because certainly, at least if you talk to Polish civilians, they will tell you that life under the Soviet Union was anything but free. But that was who liberated Auschwitz, and that becomes part of the equation. So, you know, at least in America, we tend to tie it into a place where the Jews took matters into their own hands and at least did something as opposed to die, which isn't to say there wasn't resistance in Auschwitz. Come back next week. And we'll talk about it, because there was, you know, as far as that goes. But between Rwanda and really, before I even had put the two together and realized that we were on that anniversary anyway, I thought it appropriate with Yom HaShoah to start with a very brief prayer. So we remember those who died, those we know, and those whose very names are lost. We mourn for all that died with them, their goodness and wisdom that could have done so much to ennoble and enrich humanity. We mourn the genius and the wit that died, the learning and the laughter that were lost. They are like candles that shine from the darkness, and in their light we know what goodness is. May their memory give us strength in our daily fight against cruelty, prejudice, tyranny, and persecution. Amen. So, issue today, survival and how it played out. You know, and one of the reasons, normally I probably would have done this a little bit later in the series, but wanted to do it really in part also to give you, at least those of you that are here, a little bit of background for our speaker on Sunday morning. Because Sunday morning we have Dr. Alex Kaur speaking to the congregation. For those of you who are less familiar with Alex, he is well, he's a very personable guy. He's the son of two survivors, one of whom I won't really talk about today, but the other I will talk about in a few minutes. Is his father was liberated from Buchenwald, and his mother is a survivor of Auschwitz and the experiments by Joseph Mengele. So, and I will talk a little bit about, and their stories really make for pretty compelling testimony. And his experience, not just in terms of what they went through, but his experience, as you can imagine, growing up in a family of Holocaust survivors, carried its own experience. And so he will talk a little bit about what that was like and how that has helped shape his life as well as everybody else around him. So that's, what's coming on Sunday morning. For those, we do have a couple of people with us today that are not members of the congregation. If you would like to join us Sunday morning at 10:30, let me know, and I will be happy to send you the link, or contact Vanessa or the office. They can send you the link as well.
I'll put the link in the chat.
Okay, that works too. But it will be an interesting presentation. So that kind of dictated a little bit of why this topic today, along with everything else. One of the things, I guess, to recognize is that, ultimately over 6 million Jews were murdered. What that means, though, is that about 3.5 million survived. And I guess that's the group that I talk about more than today than the 6 million who were murdered. Some of them, of course, fled and ended up in places like the United Kingdom or the United States or Palestine or whatever. But many of them ended up in hiding. And so with the end of the war in the spring of 1945, they were finally able to emerge, I guess, for want of a better term. And many of the others, of course, most of them that survived were in camps that were liberated. And that is probably a good place for me to go here and talk a little bit about survival, and hopefully everybody can see that reasonably well, and this will work. Because what happened with survival is fairly remarkable. Of course, one of the first ones that was liberated, and certainly one that we are familiar with and know about, is Auschwitz, as I said, on January 27th of 1945. And what the Soviets found there really just kind of beggars the imagination in terms of what it was like. I mean, obviously it was full of disease and it smelled and it was dirty and it was awful, but it was filled with corpses, like that center picture, bodies everywhere. There were about 7,600 survivors still walking within the fences of Auschwitz. But perhaps even more indicative, because tens of thousands, of course, had been evacuated on the forced marches into Europe, trying to keep them ahead of the advance of the Soviet troops. But what was also found in Auschwitz was 348,820 men's suits in warehouses, 836,255 women's coats. I mean, those kinds of things begin to give a sense of the scope of what was going on there that goes far beyond the bodies and the survivors. And perhaps the one that is most remarkable, over 7 tons of human hair that was there when they opened up Auschwitz. So, that's what they're finding. And then, of course, it began in other places as well. By April, the Americans, the British, we were all liberating camps mostly in the West. Buchenwald was liberated on April 11th. And actually the picture in the upper left, for what it's worth, is one of the more famous pictures of one of the barracks at Buchenwald. In part, because, of course, totally unbeknownst to anybody at the time the picture was taken, one of the people, and I believe it's this one right here, if you can see where my arrow is Elie Wiesel, who was at Buchenwald and happened to be in the picture that was taken at that moment. Bergen-Belsen was liberated on April 15th, Dachau on April 29th. And so one after another, they began to enter and find these conditions. I mean, the picture in the lower right, in a manner of speaking, has always been one of my favorites. I've taken at Bergen-Belsen because the emotion and I mean, that it's just, to me, that's an incredibly moving picture. And I thought it would be helpful to give you a little idea of what was being found by sharing a different item with you. Let's see whether I can pull this. Where are you? There you are. This one up. Can you see this? It's just a blue screen basically at the moment, but am I okay with that? Didn't work? Okay, let me try it a different way then. Let's do that. And then let's do that. And now hopefully that one works better. Okay.
Yeah, it says Liberation of Dachau.
Dachau, right. And this is actual film footage that was taken when they entered the gates at Dachau. Lest you wonder what we're doing wrong next, you aren't going to hear anything because it's silent. It's a couple 3 minutes long, but this time it is not that I forgot to share the sound. It's just there's none to share. And it's a little small, but you can begin to get a little idea of what was being found and how horrifying. Okay, and there we go. The footage, I think, gives a different depth and dimension to it than the photographs do. But what they find is, and it was true in all of them, each camp is littered in bodies and survivors that were in such critical condition that the deaths didn't stop just because the camps had been liberated. There were, for example, 58,000 prisoners in Bergen-Belsen when it was liberated. Within the first 5 days, 14,000 of them died of disease, starvation, and so on. I mean, they were too far gone. Even having been freed, they couldn't save them. And another 14,000 died over the next few weeks of all the disease and malnourishment and so on. If you do the math in your head pretty quickly, pretty easily, I mean, nearly half of the survivors didn't survive when all is said and done. We couldn't help them. We didn't understand what we were looking at or what to do with that. What the soldiers would tend to do. One of the first things, you see these people starving and in this condition, what's your first instinct? Give them some food. And so these soldiers would absolutely, with the best of intentions, give them chocolate bars, give them their K rations, or the dog, if you prefer that. This is what happened. Yeah, thanks, Gordy. This is what happens when my wife walks in the door. Okay, sorry about that. I mean, the bottom line is, with all good intention, they gave them food and their systems couldn't handle it. It was too rich. It caused dysentery and went right through them. And so it actually ended up killing people. If any of you remember the series Band of Brothers, a number of years ago that was run. One of the last of the episodes showed the liberation of a camp, and they show this with the soldiers, trying to give them food and then having to take it all back when they realized what was happening. And you can imagine the reaction of the prisoners when they start taking everything back and saying, no, we're putting you back on bread and water to try to build you up to a position where you can handle the food. It's horrific. And the words, one of the American generals who was involved in the liberation of camps, a guy by the name of Felix Sparks, his comment was, the men of the 45th Infantry Division were hardened combat veterans. We had been in combat almost 2 years at that point. While we were accustomed to death, we were not able to comprehend the type of death we encountered at Dachau. It was so bad. And so what they end up doing is, in essence, just burning it down in many cases. It was so infested with lice and other, bugs and disease and so on, that the best thing they could do was let the people stand around and watch as they just torched the whole thing. And then, of course, the next step is to try to begin to give people something to function with. And you end up giving them, because there were all these warehouses filled with supplies, if you will, that had been taken from the inmates when they arrived. And so they started giving them food and toiletries and giving them clothing. I mean, look at the woman on the left and imagine trying to fit somebody into clothing in that kind of condition, and how difficult it is. But there was this attempt to function, I guess, and begin to get them moving, which is what we need to look at, I guess, in a little bit more, detail for want of anything. Did they have access to blankets and clothes?
You were answering that as.
Yeah, I mean, there was some, certainly not enough, but the problem is the ignorance about what we were dealing with, and I'll come to that a little bit, in terms of what happened with trying to supply these people and so on. But the other thing to think about for a second is how these people felt when they were liberated, and trying to put ourselves in, which we can never do. Realistically, it's just, we can't. But I mean, trying to put ourselves into their heads in their place. And I mean, I'll throw this out, especially it's a relatively small crowd anyway. What would they be feeling, do you think?
I would think that.
I think they, sorry, go ahead.
Disbelief.
Okay.
Disbelief that they were actually going to be free, that they might actually live.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say trust. Like, I'm not sure if they trusted that they were really going to be free, or if this was just another ploy to get them somewhere else.
Yeah, and that is something that the Nazis had done to them often enough. Tell them one thing only to take them somewhere else, do something else. In some cases, say you're free to go, and then shoot them as escapees. That absolutely believing is this really what's happening is very difficult.
Susan, did you have something else?
I was going to say the same thing Holly said, that they would not trust that this was actually happening for them.
We've just started to have conversations around Macomb about coming back into the building. And it's not like the Holocaust, but, people have anxieties about being in a crowd and, changing things. And you magnify that 1,000 times of these people, meeting other people, being let out. It had to be so traumatic. Yeah. Karen said, I think sometimes about a mindset of scarcity of resources and how much that stuck continued through their descendants. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I had a colleague who was an educator, And another educator said, and he was a survivor, this educator, that he had chocolate hidden all over his room.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Certainly the fear that there's a trick, and then there's the, and what am I going to do next anyway? And yeah, it is really heartbreaking. One of the ones, and let's see whether we can, it's going to be over here. No, I need the, but it fits right into what we're talking about here, is a woman by the name of Madeline Deutsch. And this one does have sound.
I was 18, but I was in fact only 13, because those years were nothing. Those were erased from my life. So I was 13 years old in an 18-year-old girl's body. And I didn't know anything. I was a frightened little girl. I could not communicate with anybody except the immediate family, my mother's sister and brother-in-law and their son, their only son. And then we went to New York again, my mother's aunt and her cousins. I couldn't go out to the street. I was petrified. I was afraid that the Nazis are still out there. I was having nightmares for years and years, for many years. I was still reliving everything. The trip to Auschwitz, the beatings, the killings, the dead people that were taken off the train, the beatings and the dogs that were released and jump on the people and tear them apart. I lived with this years and years. I still live with it, but I don't have these horrible nightmares anymore, except occasionally. After a day like, for example, today, I'm sure I'll have some of it. But this was for years, and it was a horrible, horrible thing.
One of the things a lot of the survivors that I've heard talk about is that they have gotten over it to some degree. But then when they come and testify that night, they relive it again and redream it. There was a survivor by the name of Hadassah Bimco, who's actually quoted at the Skokie Museum, saying, "We had been liberated from death and from the fear of death, but we were not free from the fear of life." Mm. And that's certainly, that's certainly one piece of it. I love it. It's kind of an interesting group because you jump right past some of the most obvious. The first thing when my students, I'd ask this question, the first thing I'd hear about, of course, is the elation and the joy and the relief and, oh my God, we're free, which of course is a huge part of what they felt as well. And I didn't bother to worry about giving you some of those testimonies. There's so many of them, and you can probably imagine them pretty easily anyway. People saying this was now their birthday is their liberation day, and that this was the greatest day of their life, and how wonderful it all was. But the other side of that is the incredible anger and sadness and difficulty. And I have one other clip, if I can find her. Let's see, Ruth Deutsch. Yeah, I think there she is. And it's a pretty telling testimony too.
I was very bitter after the war towards everybody. How they allowed me to go through such misery for so long. And then on top of it, I didn't even know for a few months that my mother survived or my father, which he didn't. And I was terribly angry at everything and everybody, because nobody even cared after I survived that I survived. I had to be protected even after that. When we were in the orphanage in Krakow, we were not allowed to go out because some people felt that we should not have survived. And it was not safe to go out from from the house that we were kept in the garden. That was the only place we were allowed to go. And the war wasn't even over then. It was the spring of 45. So after surviving all this, and my God, the thoughts, the hate that I had, the things that I was going to do to the Germans for doing these things to us. It's awesome for a child to even think about these. You know, I'm even afraid to think about them now myself. I was going to be a butcher. The things that I was going to do to revenge. And then, actually with the help of Mother, to try to forget the past, I realized that living a normal life and continue being to be able to feel and enjoy that I was not destroyed.
It's one of the things I think will be interesting for all of us on Sunday, because when Alex Core talks about his parents' experience, you'll hear, you know, I think you will. We'll see, because I haven't heard his presentation yet. But he will. I mean, his parents went through this. The joy, the relief, the anger, the bitterness, the fear. It's all there. You know, and so we'll get some of that. The Ruth Deutsch, Ruth Weber, it was Marilyn Deutsch, who spoke that the second recording I had for you. I really can't tell you too much about her, except that actually one of her other testimonies is about some of what she witnessed in the camp, which is some of the most shocking and horrifying things I've ever heard in terms of the brutality of what she saw. But it's some stuff from the U.S. Holocaust Museums. I assume it's on their website. It's actually, I've got it on a disc that I got from them a number of years ago with these little snippets of testimony. So I can't tell you, unfortunately, a lot about her other than kind of what you see there. But the other feeling I'll throw out there, and it's one that I think few of us think about at first, and yet when you stop and think about it, it makes all kinds of sense. And one of the most difficult things I think that people talk about is the guilt when they were liberated. That the survivors looked at it and thought, why am I alive? What did I do that I should be here when my family's gone, my friends and community and neighbors are gone? What makes me so worthy? You know, what does God intend for me if they believed in God still, which some did, some didn't? You know, why am I here? And, you know, or is it just a matter of luck? And that's not a very satisfying answer, even though it probably was accurate, at least for a certain number of people as well. And so that guilt becomes an incredibly difficult piece of this as well. And so they're liberated, they're free, you know, but now what? Where do you go? And how do you go? You know, I mean, these people have absolutely nothing. They don't own clothing. They don't have any possessions. They don't know who's alive, but they don't know anybody, you know, if anybody's even there. So where do you go and what do you do and how do you get there, let alone how sick and weakened, you know, and emaciated they are. So some of them left quickly and of course, in many cases returned home, which I'll come back to in just a second. But most of them probably spent at least a little bit of time in what were known as DP, displaced person camps. Until they were ready to leave. And the idea behind the DP camps, in essence, was to nurse people back to health and enable them to then move out into the world and resume their lives. But of course, where do they build them? Where do they have the space? Many of them ended up in the camps behind barbed wire. I mean, the gate might be unlocked and open for them, but you know, they're back in the same buildings and behind the same fences. They were crowded, they were unsanitary. If you read some of the accounts of what these camps looked like and felt like and so on, they were unsanitary, they were a mess. In many cases, they were there with previous captors. People who had been guards in the, at the camp were now being held at the camp where they were. And in many cases, the DP camps are being run by people. Well, to call them unsympathetic is being very gentle. If some of you are familiar with General George Patton, for example, he was a harsh anti-Semite who basically said the Jews had gotten what they deserved and they were not quite human. And why do we have to worry about them? They're just slowing us down from doing what we got to deal with. So there's only minimal amounts in some cases of compassion and sympathy for what they're going through. Others far more well-intentioned than Patton, but totally ignorant. As I said before, there's no precedent. There's no understanding of what they're dealing with. Imagine what happens after, a day or two and they say, you smell and you're dirty and you're lice infested. Let's go to the showers and get you cleaned up. And of course, think of what these people heard when that comment is made, and the soldier or whomever that says that is like, why are you so aghast? Why are you shrinking back? Why, don't understand the dynamic of what they're dealing with. So the DP camps were, well-intentioned, especially given nobody knew what else to do or had any experience, but they were not necessarily a really good experience. And in some cases, people might only be there for a few weeks, a couple of months, but some people were there for years because they had nowhere to go. But eventually they had to leave. And where do you go at that point? And of course, as I started to say before, where do you go? In many cases, people went home, to see if there was anybody there and to try to figure out what to do next. But of course, nobody was there in many cases. So you end up with a place like Częstochowa, Poland, where there were 28,500 Jews before the war, 800 left at the end of the war. So they returned to nothing. There were over 68,000 Jews in Krakow, Poland before the war, 145 today in Krakow. The population was gone. And when people went home, their house wasn't going to be returned to them. They go to their house and somebody's living there. And their attitude is, hey, I've been here for years. This is my house. This isn't your house, anymore. I'm not moving. I'm not going anywhere. That's your problem. You've been gone. And so, they're, and the same thing with their goods. My furniture's there. My clothing's there. That had all been given to the residents of the community, and they're not giving it away. They're not giving it back up, and instead would greet them with, you were taken away to die. Why are you here? Why did you come back? That would literally be the question. Why did you come back? You should have just died. And so, they come back to this hostile environment that only gets worse. One of the most notorious, a place, again, my Polish pronunciation, Kielce, I think is how they pronounce it in Poland. There were 24,000 Jews before the war. 150 made it back. And when they came back, the village didn't want them back, wasn't going to give them their possessions or their housing or anything back. They staged a massive pogrom, killed 42 of them, injured another 50, and then drove them all out. So that's the problem. And the survivors face this range of emotions and difficulties in deciding what to do next. Some never cope. We alluded to this a few minutes ago, the people who grow up in this environment and so on. There was a film that that I had seen, and there were some people talking, including this woman who was living in Israel. It's 50 years after World War II was over. And she's talking about how her children tell her, Mom, you never smile. You're never happy. You've lived your whole life in misery. How sad, and what a victory in a warped way for the Nazis to be told you never can be happy again. There was another survivor, a woman by the name of Edith Levy, whose comment, the worst part of the Holocaust is what comes afterward. It is the realization that one must continue living for the rest of one's life with part of one's soul amputated. And so to try to wrap our arms around it a little bit more, I thought it might be good to look at two cases in a little bit more detail, kind of like what we did a couple weeks ago with the ghetto, to look at two different responses, and then maybe we can spend a few minutes kind of kicking around what we think of that and what to make of it all. The first of them, and for this, we'll go back time. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Is it okay to ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's really a two-part question. Number one is more of a recommendation that I'm watching, I don't know how I'm into it, this Hemingway PBS documentary by Ken Burns that's on this week. And what you're talking about is what he wrote about surviving his injuries from World War I. And he's quoted as saying, dying would have been much easier. And he gets into the emotions. Why did I survive the blast and my comments didn't? It's so hard to go through that trauma and then go on, exactly what that woman was quoted as saying. So if anyone's interested in the topic, I'd highly recommend watching it. And second is, I guess, who is responsible for this horrible handling? Was it the Russians? Was it the Americans? Or was it just chaos at the top and it was chaos delivered?
Well, there's probably blame to go around, truth be known. The DP camps are more a function really of the West than the Soviets. So I'm not sure we could particularly, they didn't treat people well either. They did unbelievable things as well, the atrocities, but I'm not sure that that particular scenario is one to pin on them. But I think more than anything, it was ignorance. Nobody had any experience or had ever dealt with anything like this and didn't know what to do. And so, yeah, some of them are probably ill-intentioned, or anti-Semitic or whatever, but an awful lot of it was people who just didn't know what else.
It's like what's like going on at the border right now, and with these immigrants coming across from Mexico and trying to handle all these kids.
Yeah. And they're shoved into too small space because it wasn't built for that. And even if our current administration is well-intentioned, the reality is it's in no position really to take care of them and handle them.
Right.
And historically, was PTSD a known condition then? It obviously existed, but was it a clinically diagnosed condition that could be treated?
Not really. They called it shell shock after World War I. And so, I mean, they weren't totally unfamiliar with it, but they didn't really understand it or know what to do with it. And I don't know which one of you were there, let alone would remember a year later, but Yom HaShoah last year when we lost our speaker at the last minute, and I actually talked a little bit more about survivors and particularly the next generations. And I made the comment then, not only was virtually every survivor a victim of PTSD, as you would imagine, but we've learned that it's inherited and passed down through the generations. So the second generation generally suffers from it differently, obviously, but still has it. And I don't know, I haven't seen a lot of studies, but probably the third generation and so on as well. So it's certainly a different understanding of it today. Anybody else? Okay, so let me there it is. There we go. So two cases to kind of try to fairly quickly talk us through, because I'm trying to keep my eye on the time a little bit. But the first one is that fellow, Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal became actually pretty famous after the war. He ended up settling in Southern California. Has created an institute there, but he was also known as the Nazi hunter. He hunted down former Nazis that had fled or gotten away, and dealt with them Somewhere I saw a number of about 1,100 of them, but I don't trust me on that number without my re-verifying. It's in my head somewhere. But the interesting piece about Simon Wiesenthal is a piece that he wrote. It's actually a short book called The Sunflower, which I would certainly recommend to anybody who's got a little time to look at it. And I know somewhere along the line, Vanessa and I were working on a source list for people, and that was one of them. I would send poor Vanessa an email. Oh, and I forgot The Sunflower. So it'll be on there.
I mean, and of course, the quintessential books, for me, are Elie Wiesel's. And I find it fascinating in elementary school or in middle school. In Illinois, you must teach the Holocaust. And sometimes they give them these works of fiction that, a seventh grader should not be reading, and why not read these firsthand accounts by these men?
Yeah, there's some really great stuff, and The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is compelling, but it's not exactly the perfect choice. It's charitably put, controversial. Simon Wiesenthal in The Sunflower tells the story, though. It's actually fairly remarkable. He was at the time in a work camp. He was an inmate, a prisoner of one of the camps, and he was headed for work on a work detail. And as he walked out, and they're walking down to work, in one of the buildings there, it develops, had been turned into kind of, I guess, sort of a field hospital or whatever. And in that hospital, in a darkened room, is an SS soldier by the name of Carl, who is dying. He's been mortally wounded. He's wrapped in bandages and the whole bit. And this is, a true story. This is not a piece of fiction. He's there and he's dying. And he asked the people there to find him a Jew, quote unquote, just get me a Jew. And as luck would have it, the guy they just pull out of the line, you come this way, is Simon Wiesenthal. So he's led into this room and sat down next to this guy who's clearly in horrific shape. And the guy starts off, I was not born a murderer, and now proceeds to tell him, in essence, his story about growing up in the church and then becoming part of the Hitler Youth, because essentially everybody in Germany became part of the Hitler Youth, unless you were Jewish, but everybody else did. And when the war broke out, he ended up volunteering and becoming part of the SS, and was sent to the Eastern Front, where they were told to have no pity, and goes on to tell the story about an incident that took place in a small village in Ukraine, where I guess 30 Nazis had been killed in a bombing. And they rounded up 300 Jews, crammed them into a 3-story house, locked the doors, poured gasoline everywhere, and threw in hand grenades, and set it ablaze, and of course killed the people. And Carl and the other soldiers surrounded the house and not only listened to the people screaming and begging to be let out and dying and so on, but part of their job, and he talks about it, is at one point a father and a son and a mother jumped out of a 2nd-story window trying to flee, and he shot him and killed him, because that's what he was there to do. And they then, when this was all over, they went back to their camp and sang and drank and had, dinner and so on. And now he turns to Simon Wiesenthal and says, forgive me. I'm asking for your forgiveness. I'm a dying man. Forgive me. What should Wiesenthal do? Well, I'll tell you what he did do, since I'm watching the time and nobody jumped on it. He stood up and walked out. Didn't even answer him. Didn't say a word. Stood up and walked out. And obviously wrestled with that decision. Apparently that night back at the work, in the prison, the camp where he was being held, there was a big debate over what should have been done. Should he have said, yes, I forgive you? Should he not? Why? And so on. Obviously, he wrestled with it because he wrote this book years later, talking about the incident. But of course, in this group, most of us probably recognize, if nothing else, Jewish tradition teaches us that it would not be his place to forgive. You can forgive for what has been done to you, but it is not your place, according to Jewish custom, to forgive on behalf of others. And so I guess one could argue the Jewish consensus would be that what he did was okay. But the interesting piece of that is to contrast that story with Alex Cora's mother, Eva, who some of you may be familiar with a little bit, I don't know. But Eva, well, the picture you're looking at actually two pictures to briefly explain. The color one is Eva at Auschwitz years later. Obviously, one only has to look to realize she's elderly there, and much later. But she was brought to Auschwitz as a child in 1944, and the second picture, or the black and white picture, shows the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27th. And as I say, it was staged by the Soviets. They basically lined up the people that were there that had survived and marched them between these fences multiple times, filming it and photographing it so they could prove what they had done. The irony of the whole thing, and this picture is shown in Auschwitz, it's blown up to the size of a full wall in one of the buildings at Auschwitz. Eva Kor is one of those two girls in the very front of the line with her sister Miriam. The reason they're at the front of the line, if you look, they're in the striped pajamas and almost nobody else is, because basically the people at the camp refused, long story short, refused to wear the pajamas anymore now that they were free. And Eva's attitude was, it's cold, I'll take any extra layer of clothing I can get. And so she wore it, so they put her in the front. And that's why she's in the very front of the picture. Vintage Eva, that she would be very practical and say, I want to be warm. When she arrived at Auschwitz with her family, they got off the cattle car on the platform. Her siblings and her parents were led away. They were gassed. She never saw them again. But she and her twin sister, Miriam, were pulled aside. And the key, of course, is the descriptor I just used of Miriam, her twin sister. They took one look and realized that they had a pair of twins. She became part of the experiments of Dr. Joseph Mengele and the notorious work that he did there. And we don't have the time for me to go into great detail, but a brief aside about Mengele, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. There were about 200 physicians and scientists involved in 70 different research programs across multiple camps. Mengele is just the most notorious of them, probably. They were performing experiments on Jews of all sorts, many of which would be illegal in Nazi Germany, even to use on animals. Notably, for example, the use of vivisection, which basically is taking somebody and cutting them open while they're still alive, without anesthetic, without anything, so that they can see the organs functioning and look at what they're looking at. It's illegal to do it on dogs, but it was legal to do it to Jews. Bottom line. They tested drugs, psychedelic type drugs, as well as injecting diseases into people, including Eva, and then different treatments for it. Subjecting them to limits, trying to determine the limits that humans could handle with temperature extremes, air pressure changes. A lot of this, of course, was about genetics and sterilization. Mengele had arrived in Auschwitz in 1943. And as I say, he was notorious. He did all of these things and more. But he particularly liked using twins. And the reason, if you think about it from a scientific standpoint, is, it makes a lot of sense, because you've got two people that are genetically about as close to identical as you're ever going to be able to get. You could perform an experiment on one, and then based on the results, what happened, you could then kill the other and do a comparative autopsy. And so that's why he liked twins. It was the perfect control. There were over 3,000 pairs of twins at Auschwitz. 26 survived. the experiments, of which Eva and her sister Miriam were one of those 26. Bottom line, as I say, she was injected with the disease, got very ill, but willed herself to live. I imagine Alex will talk a little bit about it. But the key here is that 50 years later, she returned to Auschwitz and publicly forgave Mengele for what he had done, and then went on and forgave the rest of the Nazis. And as you can imagine, this is incredibly controversial at the time and ever since. I mean, I could give you a list of survivors who agree that what she did was great and others who don't agree. She claimed this was about giving herself freedom and control over her own life, that this had nothing to do. She would take great pains to say, I'm not, doing this on behalf of anybody else. I'm doing this for me. And so that I can get over this because the pain has been too much. And she spent decades angry and having all kinds of issues. And this allowed her to let go and move on with her life. And like I said, claims I'm not telling anybody else what to do. Now, for those of us who spent a little bit of time around Eva, I got to tell you that while every time I heard her talk about it, she would say, I'm not telling anybody else what to do. But it was clear that she was making a strong suggestion that this would be good for you like it was for me. There was nothing subtle in that sense, even though she couched it. But Lord knows a different answer than Simon Wiesenthal. And so we've only got a couple minutes left. I don't think we're going to break into a lot of groups, and it's a small group, but I'll just, it's maybe not ours fully to judge since none of us were there, but who got it right? How do you react to these? What do you make of this?
I actually think any way you go, people get mad. Like, people get mad that you don't forgive, and when you forgive, people get mad. So it's so personal, it's really hard to weigh in on something. For me, it's hard to weigh in on something like this.
I agree. I think there's no perfect answer. I think that there were a lot of victims. I think a lot of the young German youth, not that it's okay for what they did, but they were, if you're a young, they had their life on the line too. I don't know if I could forgive, but you have to look at everybody. I don't think you can win either way.
Have at it, Rick.
I think maybe they both got it right. As we earlier said, I don't think Wiesenthal, I don't think it was his to forgive. The atrocity wasn't committed specifically against him, for which the Nazis sought forgiveness. With Eva Kor, to be taken at her own word, she was doing it for herself for the atrocity that was perpetrated on her. I think it was, quote unquote, her business to seek redress in the way she sought it. I don't know that it has to go beyond in a more generalized sense, except for her own statement and her own fulfillment. So I don't know that it was wrong for either one of them. I would back both of them for their responses.
Well, I'm very taken with Eva's statement that it was really an act to free herself. Mm-hmm. It wasn't anything she was really bestowing upon anyone else. It was a selfish act for her to go forward. And I think, we all kind of, this whole retribution, forgiveness thing. I think as we learn more about, we realize, how much the internal process is. When any of us become obsessed with anything in our head, angry at somebody, and we think about it, and it just kind of consumes us. And, Eva found a way to kind of move on from it. pretty amazing. I don't know how things like that ever begin to comprehend it.
It's pretty remarkable. One of the comments that was made, and actually Tim and I were both at a presentation with the Minister of Justice from Rwanda 2 weeks ago, I think it was, or 3 weeks ago, I forgot, but recently. And when we talk about justice in the last session, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the comments he made is that revenge is a black hole. Oh, you weren't there, Tim. Okay, I thought you were there. Okay, you missed a good one. But one of the comments he made is that revenge is a black hole, and I mean, you could make the argument that Simon Wiesenthal spent the rest of his life dealing with it, and that Eva found a way to work around it. Although, if you watched Eva's life and what she did and so on, I'm not sure that she let it go quite as much as she sometimes said she did, which is rather presumptuous of me. It isn't like I know her so all fired well to judge that, but it's really difficult, and I guess none of us have been there.
And I think it's a good segue to remind people that Alex Core, her son, will be here on Sunday. I put the link in the chat. If you need more help getting the link, just email me. It'll be in your Macomb at home as well. But these, we'll have a chance. I told Alex that our participants like to ask questions. And, it's such a pillar of her teachings. I can't imagine he won't touch on it.
No, I'm sure he will. I'll leave you with two quick thoughts, and then I don't know if we got other questions or people want to do whatever. I got nowhere I got to be till 8 o'clock tonight. So, but
we can't go that long. We can go a little longer.
Yeah, there you go. But just two, and they're both very short. One of the things that Eva was very clear about and consistent about when she talked about it, and she passed away about a year and a half ago. But she made a big point of saying forgiveness is not forgetting. And some people accused her of saying you're trying to forget and move on. And she was very particular that that's not what she was trying to do and not what she was doing. And I think there's a distinction there that's important, even, for us as well. The other thought that I'll leave you with is from a different survivor, a woman by the name of Estelle Laughlin, who lives actually just a few miles up the road here.
We heard her at Legacy Lakeside, right?
I don't know whether we ever got her. I'm
99 that I've heard her.
Yeah, it's quite possible. She's a very good speaker. She's very interesting, and I didn't remember for sure whether she did or didn't make it to Lakeside. Some I remember and some I don't. But one of the comments that she made in a conversation with me, but I've heard her use it in a presentation multiple times as well, is that life is full of pain and suffering, regardless of whether you're a survivor of the camps. Life is full of pain and suffering. But what we do with that is under our control. And the way she phrased it was, misery is a choice, even though suffering is not. And I think that's just a great statement, and maybe a good spot to say I'm done for the day.
Okay. It's great to see everybody. I would be remiss if I did not give you a few announcements. We have Alex this week, and we also have in a couple of weeks a challah. A challah, you can order challah dough. So, I'll put that in the link as well, in the chat, the link in the chat. And if you ever need anything, you know where to get me, and we'll see you next week. Please, pass it around. People are welcome to come. And I think Jim will remind people that I'm going to call them lectures, are not predicated on what we learned the week before. Anybody can pick it on up.
Yeah.
I thank you, Jim.
Well, and thank you all for coming and listening and indulging me. Tim, the answer on Sunday is that Chicago time, he's on at 10:30 in the morning. I think you're an hour ahead of us, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay, I wasn't sure what the split was. So
it's 3 o'clock here, Tim. So you work that out on your own.
Yeah, but
Nashville and Chicago run the same time.
Right.
Okay. So 10:30 is when it goes on.
Hypothetically speaking, we also record. So Tim, if you need the recording, get back to me. All right. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.